Stagecoach driver dumped fat girl in middle of nowhere. Mountain man appeared and roared. "Pay $20 more or walk," the driver barked, his voice cutting through the dry Nevada air like a whip. Beatrice Hartwell froze on the dusty road, clutching her small valise to her chest. The other passengers stared, some amused, some pitying, as the stagecoach driver, Luther Grimm, spat a wad of tobacco into the dirt. "You're slowing the team down, girl. Big as you are, I should have charged you double from St. Louis." Bee's cheeks burned crimson beneath her bonnet. "Please, sir, I paid all I had. I'm only trying to reach California. My aunt—" "Then you can walk there," Luther sneered. He hauled her single trunk off the coach and threw it onto the ground with a thud. The horses shifted restlessly, the coach wheels creaking under the sun. "Please," Bee whispered again, her voice breaking, but the man only snapped the reins. The stagecoach lurched forward, leaving her behind in a choking cloud of dust. Laughter drifted faintly from one of the passengers before vanishing down the long, endless road. When the dust cleared, silence fell, the kind that hums in the bones. Bee stood alone, surrounded by mountains that looked more like the backs of sleeping beasts. The air shimmered with heat, and somewhere far off, a hawk screamed. She sank to her knees beside her trunk, tears falling into the red dust. Hours passed. The light turned gold, then gray. Her throat ached from thirst. She whispered a prayer, though her voice was barely a breath. Then came the sound, the distant thunder of hooves, heavy and powerful. A shadow moved through the twilight, tall and broad upon a black horse. The rider dismounted in one motion, boots crunching against gravel. His voice, deep and furious, rolled through the stillness like thunder itself. "Who left you here to die?" The mountain swallowed his roar, and for the first time since she'd been abandoned, Beatrice dared to lift her head. Beatrice blinked through her tears as the giant of a man strode toward her. He was unlike anyone she had ever seen, towering, broad-shouldered, his dark hair tangled from wind and travel. A rifle hung across his back, and a hunting knife gleamed at his belt. But it wasn't his size that made her tremble. It was the fury in his eyes, a deep, burning blue that looked ready to strike down whoever had done this to her. He knelt beside her, the ground seeming to quake under his weight. "You hurt?" His voice was deep, gravelly, but gentler now. Bee shook her head weakly. "Just tired." The man glanced down the road, jaw tight. "Stagecoach tracks," he muttered. "Headed west. Must have been Grimm. I warned that bastard about overloading passengers." Bee tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. He noticed instantly, pulled a canteen from his saddle, and held it to her lips. The water was warm, metallic, but to her it tasted like salvation. "Drink slow," he said. "You've been baking in the sun too long." She drank greedily until he gently took the canteen back. "Thank you," she whispered. "He said I was too heavy, that I slowed his horses." Something changed in the man's face, not surprise, but a dark disgust. "He left you here for that?" His voice hardened. No man with a soul would leave a woman to die for the sake of his pride. Bee swallowed, looking down at her dirt-covered hands. "I think he just wanted someone to blame." The man stood, scanning the empty horizon. Well, he's about to learn what blame feels like. Then he crouched again, his anger softening as his gaze met hers. "Name's Magnus Ironheart. Folks up here just call me Mag. You're safe now." Bee tried to rise, but her legs buckled. Without hesitation, Magnus scooped her up into his arms. She gasped, startled by his strength. How effortlessly he carried her, as if she weighed no more than a bundle of feathers. "I can walk," she murmured weakly. "I don't doubt it," he said, voice calm. "But you won't, not till I get you warm and fed." He lifted her onto his horse, securing her with one arm while holding the reins with the other. As they rode, Bee leaned against his chest, too weak to protest. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait lulled her, and for the first time in days she felt safe enough to close her eyes. By the time they reached his cabin, a sturdy log house nestled in a valley between towering cliffs, the sky had deepened into indigo. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air. Magnus carried her inside, laying her gently on a bed covered with a thick fur blanket. "Stay still," he said. "I'll get a fire going." Bee watched him move, every motion efficient, practiced. He struck a flame, built a blaze, and filled a pot with water. "You'll eat, then sleep," he said firmly. When she whispered, "Why are you helping me?" he paused, staring into the fire. "Because no one helped my mother when she needed it," he said quietly. "I learned young what cruelty looks like, and I don't stomach it well." Bee blinked back tears. "You're kind." He shook his head. "No, ma'am, just human, which is more than I can say for the man who left you." Outside, the wind howled through the canyons, but inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. Beatrice Hartwell, abandoned, humiliated, forgotten, finally drifted into sleep, watched over by a stranger with a heart big enough to silence the mountains themselves. When Beatrice woke, the scent of broth and cedar filled the air. A soft orange light flickered against the wooden beams above her. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, only that the bed beneath her was warm, and that someone had tucked a thick fur over her shoulders. Then the memories returned. The road, the driver's cruelty, and the man whose voice had shaken the mountains. Magnus Ironheart sat near the hearth, stirring a pot of stew. The fire painted his face in shades of bronze and shadow. He looked up when she stirred. "You're awake," he said simply. Bee tried to sit, but he raised a hand. "Easy. You fainted from heat and hunger. Eat first, talk later." He handed her a wooden bowl filled with stew, rabbit, onion, wild herbs. The first spoonful nearly made her cry. It was the first real food she'd tasted in days. "Thank you," she murmured between bites. He nodded, tearing a piece of bread from a loaf and passing it to her. "You got a place you were headed?" "California," she said softly. "My aunt lives in Sacramento. She's all I have left." He leaned back in his chair, gaze thoughtful. "That's a long way through rough country. Not a road for someone traveling alone, especially after what that bastard did." "I'll find a way," she said, though her voice trembled. He studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You will, but not tonight." The next morning Magnus saddled his horse and packed supplies, water, dried meat, and an extra blanket. "We'll ride to the next town. You can rest there a few days, decide what to do next," he said. Bee hesitated. "I don't want to trouble you." He gave her a faint smile, rare but real. "You're not trouble. You're someone who didn't deserve what happened. That's enough reason for me." The trail climbed steeply into the high country. The air turned crisp, and the scent of pine replaced the dust of the plains. Bee rode behind Magnus, holding on to his coat as the horse picked its way over narrow paths. At first she was frightened, of falling, of slowing him down, of being a burden. But Magnus never once complained. When she grew tired, he stopped without a word, lifting her gently down to rest by the river. When her hands grew numb from cold, he handed her his gloves without meeting her eyes. "You'll need these more than I do," he said. At night, they camped beside the fire. The first evening she tried to apologize again for the inconvenience. He cut her off. "You don't apologize for surviving," he said, eyes fixed on the flames. They fell into a rhythm, her soft laughter breaking the silence now and then, his deep voice telling stories of the mountains and the tribe he once lived among. She learned he was the son of a white trapper and a Shoshone woman, raised between two worlds that both saw him as an outsider. "I stopped trying to belong," he said one night. "The land doesn't ask questions. It just lets you live if you respect it." Bee looked at him through the firelight, the giant who had roared at the wind and now spoke with the patience of an old oak. "I think the world would be kinder if more men were like you," she said softly. He glanced at her, a flicker of something unguarded in his eyes. "Don't go making me into something I'm not, Bee." "Then what are you?" she asked. He poked at the fire. "A man who hates seeing good people hurt." The wind sighed through the trees, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Somewhere deep inside, Bee realized that her fear had faded. The road ahead was still long, but as long as she rode beside Magnus Ironheart, she wasn't afraid of being left behind again. When dawn came, she looked back once at the trail they had taken, a single set of hoof prints winding through the wild. She whispered to herself, "He found me where the world forgot me." And in that quiet truth, her heart began to heal. By the time they returned to Magnus's cabin, the mountain air had turned sharp with the coming of winter. The days grew shorter, the wind colder, but inside the log walls there was a steadiness that wrapped around Bee like a second heartbeat. The journey had worn her thin, yet something new glowed in her eyes, strength she hadn't known she possessed. Magnus had built his cabin years ago on a rise overlooking a wide valley. It wasn't large, but every inch spoke of care. Tools lined neatly along one wall, herbs hanging to dry above the hearth, and a single carved chair by the window where the morning light always fell. When Bee saw it for the first time, she said softly, "It looks like a place that listens." He gave a rare smile. "That's why I built it here." In the days that followed, she found her rhythm in the quiet. Magnus would be gone for hours, hunting or checking traps, returning with a rabbit slung over his shoulder or firewood stacked in his arms. Bee kept the hearth alive, mended clothes, and made simple meals from what he brought back. She sang while she worked, old hymns her mother had taught her, and sometimes Magnus would stop in the doorway, listening in silence until she noticed. One afternoon, when snow began to fall in soft, lazy flakes, Bee went outside to hang laundry. The wind caught her skirt, tangling it around her boots, and she laughed, a sound bright enough to echo through the pines. Magnus looked up from chopping wood, startled by the warmth of it. For a long time he hadn't realized how much silence had weighed on him until she broke it. Later that evening he handed her a pair of fur-lined mittens. "Made from rabbit pelts," he said. "Your hands shouldn't freeze for my pride." She slipped them on and smiled. "They're perfect. Thank you, Mag." He cleared his throat, turning away as if embarrassed. "Just keeping you in one piece." Nights were the hardest for her. The wind would howl against the shutters, and she'd wake from dreams of the road, of laughter and dust, and the sound of wheels leaving her behind. Once Magnus found her sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide and distant. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he sat beside her, tossing another log into the flames. "Dreams fade faster if you talk to someone," he said quietly. She looked at him, her throat tight. "Everyone always told me I was too much, too loud, too soft, too big, but you don't seem to notice." He met her gaze. "Maybe that's because I look for what lasts. Kindness, grit, the part of a person that doesn't break when the world turns cruel." Something inside her trembled, not with fear, but with recognition. She had been called many things, but never strong. The next morning, when Magnus returned from hunting, he found her splitting kindling in the yard, her blows awkward but determined. "You'll take a finger off that way," he said, setting down his rifle. She wiped her brow and smiled. "Then show me how to do it right." He stepped behind her, large hands covering hers on the axe handle. "You use your weight, not your arms," he murmured, his voice low near her ear. "Let the tool do the work." Together they swung, the wood splitting cleanly with a satisfying crack. She turned, grinning. "See? I learned fast." Magnus chuckled softly, a sound that surprised them both. "That you do." As the days passed, the rhythm between them deepened, simple, unspoken, but unbreakable. He showed her how to snare rabbits, how to find tracks in fresh snow, how to read the sky before a storm. In return, she taught him how to make stew with nothing but wild roots and salt, how to sew a rip without tearing the cloth wider. Sometimes in the long evenings, they'd sit by the fire in companionable silence. The crackling wood filled the spaces where words were unnecessary. Once, as the flames flickered low, she said quietly, "I used to think I was cursed to always be left behind, but now I think being left behind brought me to the right place." He looked at her, eyes steady and full of something softer than pity, stronger than friendship. "Maybe the road knows where it's leading better than we do." Snow fell thick that night, muffling the world outside. When Bee glanced toward the window, she saw only white and shadow. But inside, the cabin glowed golden and alive. Magnus reached across the table, his rough hand brushing hers for the briefest moment. Neither spoke of it, but the warmth lingered long after the fire died down. For the first time since the stagecoach left her in the dust, Beatrice Hartwell no longer felt lost. She had found not just safety, but belonging, in the quiet kindness of a man who roared for her when no one else did. Winter deepened, the mountains turning into white, silent giants that guarded their valley. For weeks, snow piled high against the cabin walls, cutting them off from the nearest town. Yet the isolation didn't weigh on Bee the way she thought it might. Inside the cabin, she had warmth, safety, and the steady rhythm of life with Magnus Ironheart, the man who had once appeared like a storm and stayed like a promise. Still, there were shadows that crept in when the nights grew long. Magnus would sometimes go quiet, staring into the fire as if seeing ghosts in the flames. Bee had learned enough about pain to recognize its shape in someone else. One evening she asked gently, "Do you ever miss them, the people you left behind?" He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "My father died when I was a boy. My mother's people, the Shoshone, took me in. They taught me to hunt, to track, to listen. But I was always the half one, too white to belong, too red to be accepted elsewhere. When the railroad came through, men called me a savage. When I helped my mother's kin, they called me a traitor. So I stopped listening to either side." Bee's heart tightened. "You didn't stop caring, though." He glanced up, a faint, tired smile ghosting across his lips. "No, I just learned that caring comes with a cost." For days after, Bee thought about his words. She saw the way he carried the world's weight in his silence. He wasn't just a man living in the mountains. He was a man hiding from them. Then, one morning near the end of winter, trouble came knocking, in the form of a rider crashing through the snow. Magnus was outside chopping wood when the man shouted, "You Magnus Ironheart?" Magnus turned slowly. "Depends who's asking." The rider, a stocky man in a torn coat, spat into the snow. "Name's Sheriff Dalton from Silver Bend. You been harboring a woman left behind by a stagecoach driver named Luther Grimm?" Magnus's eyes narrowed. "I'm keeping alive a woman he tried to kill." "That what you mean?" The sheriff shifted uneasily. "Grimm claims you assaulted him last time he came through town. Says you threatened his life." Bee, standing at the doorway, froze. Magnus's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "If I wanted him dead, Sheriff, he'd be bones by now. He left a woman to die in the desert. That's the crime you should care about." Dalton hesitated. "Town don't take kindly to vigilantes, Ironheart. Folks say you're half wild, that you live by your own law." "I live by decency," Magnus said. "You should try it sometime." The sheriff didn't press further, but his warning was clear. "Grimm's stirring talk in town. Says that woman of yours owes him money. Claims she ran off with his property." "His property?" Magnus repeated, his voice turning low, dangerous. Bee stepped forward, trembling but firm. "I'm no man's property, not his, not anyone's." Dalton gave her a quick look, surprised by her strength, then tugged his reins. "Just passing the message, but if Grimm comes looking, you'd better be ready." He spurred his horse and disappeared into the storm. Silence filled the clearing after he left. Bee turned to Magnus. "He'll come, won't he?" Magnus nodded slowly. "Men like Grimm don't stop until someone makes them." That night, as the wind wailed outside, Magnus checked his rifle and set extra logs by the door. Bee sat quietly near the hearth, fear coiling in her chest. "I don't want you getting hurt because of me," she whispered. Magnus knelt beside her, his rough hand brushing hers. "Bee, you didn't bring trouble here. It found you. The only mistake you ever made was trusting the wrong kind of man. This time, you're not alone." Their eyes met, two souls bruised in different ways, both finding courage in the other. Outside, the storm howled like a warning, but inside, the fire burned steady, and the man who once roared for her was ready to do it again. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a world of blinding white silence. The snow shimmered beneath the rising sun, pure and untouched, except for the line of hoof prints winding toward the cabin from the east. Magnus saw them first. He loaded his rifle, jaw set. "He's here." Bee's hands tightened around the shawl she wore. "Grimm?" He nodded. "And he didn't come alone." Within the hour, 3 riders appeared through the trees, Luther Grimm at their head, flanked by 2 rough-looking men with pistols and mean grins. Grimm's face twisted with arrogance when he saw Bee standing on the porch beside Magnus. "Well, look at that," he sneered. "The big ox really did keep his pet alive." Magnus stepped forward, his sheer presence enough to make the horses snort nervously. "You've got one chance to turn around, Grimm." Grimm laughed. "Not before I get what's mine. That woman owes me money. $30 for the seat she took, and 20 more for slowing me down." Bee's voice rang out before Magnus could speak. "You threw me out like garbage. You left me to die." Grimm's grin widened. "You should have thanked me. I gave you a chance to lose a few pounds on the walk." The crack of Magnus's rifle shattered the air. The bullet hit the ground inches from Grimm's boot, sending up a spray of snow. Grim's men froze, hands twitching toward their holsters. "Next one doesn't miss," Magnus said, voice calm but deadly. "You're standing on my land, threatening a woman under my protection. That ends now." Grim tried to laugh it off, but his bravado faltered. "You'd kill a man over a fat girl?" Magnus's eyes burned. "I'd kill a man for being what you are, a coward who preys on the helpless." One of Grim's hired guns drew his weapon. Before he could aim, Magnus fired. The man's hat flew off, the shot grazing past his ear. The second outlaw backed his horse away, cursing under his breath. "Go!" Magnus growled, cocking the rifle again. Bee's heart pounded as Grim's face twisted from mockery to rage. "You'll regret this," he spat, wheeling his horse around. "You think she's worth dying for? She'll ruin you like she ruins everything she touches." "Then I'll die a rich man," Magnus said coldly, "because she's worth more than every damn soul in Silver Bend." Grim's eyes flashed with fury, but he turned and rode off, his men scrambling after him. The sound of hooves faded into the mountains until only the wind remained. Magnus lowered his rifle slowly, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Bee stepped toward him, tears glistening in her eyes. "He'll tell lies about you in town." "Let him," Magnus said. "The truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." She reached for his hand. "You could have killed him." "I wanted to," he admitted. Then, softer, "But if I had, you'd have looked at me different." Bee shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, I'd have looked at you the same, like the man who saved my life twice." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Magnus exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around hers. "It's over, Bee." And as snowflakes began to fall again, she whispered, "No, Magnus, it's just beginning." Weeks passed, and the valley softened under spring's first breath. The snow melted into streams that sang through the trees, and wildflowers began to bloom along the hillside. The world that had once been cold and cruel to Bee now felt alive again, full of color, of hope, of belonging. Magnus's cabin had changed too. Bee's touch was everywhere. Curtains she had sewn from old fabric, shelves lined with jars of herbs, the scent of bread baking in the hearth. The home of a solitary man had become a place of warmth and laughter. One morning, Magnus found her standing outside, sunlight brushing her hair like gold. She looked stronger now, not just in body, but in spirit. She turned when she heard him. "The mountain's beautiful today," she said softly. He nodded. "It is, but it's not what I'm looking at." Her cheeks flushed, and for a long moment they simply stood there, the wind tugging gently at their clothes. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small ring carved from antler. "It's not gold," he said, "but it's honest, like us." Bee covered her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. "Magnus." He took her hand, voice low but steady. "You were left in the dirt like something unwanted. But you rose out of it, Bee. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. Stay here, not because you owe me, but because you want to." She looked at the ring, then at the man who had carried her from death into life. "I don't want California anymore," she whispered. "I want home, and home is here, with you." When he slid the ring onto her finger, the mountain wind quieted, as if the earth itself paused to listen. Stories like Bee and Magnus's remind us that love often begins where hope seems lost, on a dusty road, in a stranger's kindness, in a heart that refuses to give up. It's not beauty or wealth that saves us, but courage and compassion. If you're still listening, I'd love to know, where in the world are you hearing this story from? Tell me in the comments below. And if you still believe that love can find you even in the loneliest places, don't scroll away. The next story might just be the one that finds you.